4 minutes and 37 seconds. That was the margin. The distance between the Texas that existed at dawn that Monday and a Texas with no electricity at all. Not for hours, not for days, for weeks. A dark deep enough that getting out of it would have meant building the grid back from nothing, one plant at a time, in ice. Nobody in Texas knew that number while it was happening. It would be 9 days before the man who ran the grid said it out loud, in the flat voice people use when they have not slept. By then, the funerals had started. Southwest of Houston in Sugar Land, the power had been off for more than 8 hours. So a family did what you would do. They lit the fireplace. They got out the board games and the cards and they played by firelight, and they posted about it, the way you do when the lights are out and you are making the best of it. A mother, her 3 children, and their grandmother, waiting. Olivia was 11, Edison was 8, Colette was 5, their grandmother, Loan Lay, was 75. The fire took the house at around 2 in the morning. Jackie Nguyen got out. Her mother and her 3 children did not. Neighbors had to hold her back from going in after them. Fire officials would point at the fireplace, while saying honestly they might never know for certain. What is not in doubt is why it was burning. The storm came down out of the Arctic in February of 2021 and sat on Texas. Not a squall, an occupation. Days below freezing in cities that do not build for freezing, where pipes run through attics and outside walls because, in a normal February, nothing threatens them. About 4.5 million homes and businesses lost power. Millions spent that week watching their breath in their own living rooms, sleeping in coats, sleeping in cars. They had been told it would roll. 40 minutes off, 40 minutes on. For hundreds of thousands it never rolled. It went off and stayed off. One day, then 2, then 3. And nobody could tell them why theirs and not the street behind them. This is the part that is hard to hold in your head. Those blackouts were not the grid failing. They were the grid being saved. Just after 1 in the morning on Monday the 15th of February, the operator that runs the Texas grid, ERCOT, declared its highest emergency and began cutting power to customers on purpose. Within days, it was shedding around 20,000 megawatts, the largest deliberate cut of electricity in American history. It did that because the alternative was worse. Generation was falling off the system faster than demand could be cut. Nearly half of all the power Texas could make was gone. When supply falls that far behind, the frequency of the whole system sags, and if it sags too long, protective equipment starts tripping automatically to save itself. That is not a blackout you recover from by flipping a switch. 4 minutes and 37 seconds. After that, it would not have been a decision anymore. Bill Magnus put it to his board like this: if we have a blackout of the system is out for an indeterminate amount of time. We may still be here today talking about when is the power going to come back on. So both things are true. The dark that killed people was the dark that stopped something larger. That is not a defense. It is the shape of the problem. Every option left that morning was a bad one, and the decisions that could have put a better one on the table had been made years earlier by other people in rooms with the heat on. Texas eventually counted 246 dead. About 2/3 died of the cold itself, 158 of hypothermia. Others died of what the cold interrupted: dialysis that did not happen, oxygen machines that stopped, medication that froze. The youngest was under a year old. The oldest was 101, and some were killed by the things people did to survive it. At least 11 died of carbon monoxide poisoning, and more than 1,400 were treated for it. People ran generators indoors. People sat in running cars in the garage with the door down to get warm and did not come out. In Conroe, an 11-year-old boy named Christian Pavon Pineda died in the bed he shared with his little stepbrother. His family had come from Honduras 2 years earlier. The day before he died, he saw snow for the first time in his life, and his mother filmed him playing in it. The world reported that he froze to death. He did not. The autopsy came back in May, and the cause was carbon monoxide. Investigators believed it came from the family's water heater, whose roof vent had been buried by snow. That distinction matters. The cold did not have to touch you to kill you. It only had to take the power, and then wait for you to do something reasonable. So why did half the state's power go away? The equipment froze, not exotic equipment, water lines, valves, and above all, the thin sensing lines that tell a power plant what is happening inside itself. They ice up, the plant goes blind, and it shuts down to protect itself. The second cause is the one worth slowing down for. Texas power plants mostly burn natural gas. That gas comes out of wells and moves through processing plants and compressors to reach the generators. All of that equipment runs on electricity, and almost none of it had been designated critical, the protected category, spared when the grid starts cutting people off. So when the operator began shedding load to save the system, some of the power it cut was the power running the gas fields. Gas production dropped by nearly half. Pressure fell. Power plants still standing, still staffed, still willing, could not get fuel. More generation dropped off, which meant more load had to be shed, which cut power to more gas infrastructure. The grid was strangling its own fuel supply, and the tighter it squeezed, the more it had to squeeze. In February of 2011, a cold front hit the Southwest, and Texas went into rolling blackouts again. Afterward, federal regulators put a task force on it. Its report was published that August. One of its recommendations reads in full, "The task force suggests that a review of curtailment priorities be made to consider whether gas production facilities should be treated as protected loads in the event of load shedding." Read that again with 2021 in your hand. 10 years early, the failure was described in a government document, in plain language, under the heading Recommendations. It was still a suggestion, and the report was explicit about why. Because the Federal Commission had no authority over gas production, it could only recommend that Texas lawmakers investigate whether standards should be adopted, and it listed the options it would accept, ending with this one, or the adoption of voluntary industry practices. Voluntary. That is the word this whole story turns on. 2011 was not the first time either. In December of 1989, an Arctic freeze hit Texas, and the grid resorted to rolling blackouts. The first time in its history, state regulators investigated and issued recommendations for winterizing power plants. They were not mandatory. Over the years, as the later report puts it, implementation lapsed. But it is a line from that 1989 report that should stop you. Writing about the fixes the power companies were promising, Texas regulators said this: whether the corrective actions being implemented are sufficient to prevent future freeze-off related power plant failures, only direct experience with another deep freeze will ascertain. Only another deep freeze will tell us whether we fixed it. The freeze came in 2011, and the federal task force, quoting that sentence back, wrote the answer. Texas has now had that second event, and the answer is clearly that the corrective actions were not adequate or were not maintained. They could prove it. Of the generating units that failed in '89 and were still running 22 years later, 26 of them failed again. The same machines, the same frozen instrument lines. The task force calculated that if 3/4 of that capacity had simply not failed twice, the blackouts of 2011 would not have happened at all. They also checked whether money was the reason and concluded it was not. There is one more step back, and it explains why every warning here was allowed to be optional. In 1935, Franklin Roosevelt signed a law giving the federal government authority over electricity sold across state lines. Texas utilities found the door. Keep every wire inside the state. No sale crosses a state line, and no federal regulator has standing to tell you anything. They built their grid to stop at the border. People have called it the Electric Alamo. It is why Texas could not simply import its way out of the shortage. And it is why, for more than 30 years, every recommendation to winterize the Texas grid arrived as a suggestion from somebody with no power to require it. The isolation was not a failure. It was the product, working exactly as designed. The water went with the power. Treatment plants lost electricity, pipes split in ceilings and walls, and within 5 days more than 1,100 boil water notices covered roughly 15 million people. Half the state told to boil water it mostly could not heat. The money was its own scandal. Prices were held at the ceiling of $9,000 a megawatt hour, and the market monitor found the operator kept them there for nearly 2 days after the emergency passed, an error it valued at $16 billion. The head of the State Utility Commission resigned within hours. The board fired Bill Magnus. He turned down more than $800,000 in severance. Texas did act. Weatherization became mandatory for electric generators. Federal standards followed. Almost all of the natural gas infrastructure was finally moved into the protected category, the thing the earlier report had suggested somebody look into. And in July of 2026, the grid took its hardest test since. A heat wave pushed Texas demand to an all-time high, past 90,000 megawatts, driven by data centers arriving faster than anyone planned for. The operator said it was well positioned. It held. That is real, and it should be said plainly. But it held in summer against heat, on the half of the system that got the mandates. The new rules for power plants do not reach the gas producers. The half that actually broke is still the half running on best practices, which is the polite form of the word this whole story turns on. Jackie lit a fire because the power was out. The power was out because the gas had stopped. The gas had stopped because the power was out. Nobody had broken that circle in 30 years, through 3 freezes, 2 investigations, and 1 sentence, written in 1989, asking whether anyone would ever find out if the fixes worked. Texas found out 3 times. Nobody ever wrote it down as a rule. The lights are on in Texas tonight, and the warnings are still filed under recommendation, but the postmortem writes itself. The only question is whether anyone reads it before the next one.